going to talk to you today about Gettysburg, America's epic tale central to national identity. And you know, if you are creative, you can never run out of topics on Gettysburg, right? You never can. I mean, I had 3 or 4 other ones I decided not to do, and this one was a lot of fun. I hope you'll feel the same way. But as we talk about America's epic tale today, I'm going to let the slides kind of lead things. The slideshow is well structured, and I don't want to give the story to you all in one sitting. It'll gradually develop so that by the end of the presentation, you'll feel that Gettysburg is America's epic tale. And so it starts with sort of an introduction where we talk about people making a sacred pilgrimage to Gettysburg, just like they have to other sacred sites. You know, the Indians, Eastern Indians, make trips to the Ganges River every year, and they bathe in the river. And this past summer, I taught at Delaware Valley University at the Fort Indian Town Gap campus to the military folks there and their families, credit courses there, and I taught Eastern history, non-Western history, mostly Near East, Far East. So we delved a lot into India, and that thought was in my mind as I pulled up this slide for you, that there are thousands of people that make pilgrimages there every year in the Hindu religion to use the cleansing waters and the power of the cleansing waters to renew themselves. A lot of folks will make a pilgrimage there just to die there and then have their body burned and cremated, and then the remains are thrown into the river, and they see the river as holy. And of course you see the Vola Dia Rosa, where each Easter Christians make the pilgrimage along the route that Christ followed before the crucifixion. And if you were to go to Mecca, there are people that make, you know, hundreds of thousands of people that make the trip there every year. Have you ever heard of the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer? And that's about making a pilgrimage to the site of Canterbury's cathedral and to the site of the slaying of Thomas à Becket. So pilgrimages, there are people that make pilgrimages along the Pyrenees Mountains every year to holy and sacred sites. And in the 33 calendar years that I've done programs in the National Park Service, I've noticed a look in all of the parks in the eyes of people that visit, but particularly here at Gettysburg, a look of that they're not sure why it's on their bucket list to be here. Or I'll have people apologize to me. They'll say, we keep coming back. We've been here 3-4 times in the last year. And they don't apologize to me. And I've thought, what draws them here? What draws me to stay here? And I think it's because there is something very sacred about Gettysburg as our national epic. And so we feel the pull to visit it as though it were some holy shrine. And so people do that here on the same scale as they would other sacred sites. There are 1.2 million people who visit here annually. There are 200 to 300 people that show up on an anniversary program. How many of you have been on those anniversary programs? And you know what that's like, and they're heavily attended. And oftentimes winter lectures overflow, and depending on the weather, you know. But the large crowds tell us that people want to be part of something bigger themselves and that they're searching for something. I used to joke with Gregory Coco. Some of you remember him. He passed away a few years ago and wrote a number of excellent books on the aftermath of the battle. And we would joke behind the scenes about he was about to do a little round top tour or some other tour, and I said there's going to be large crowds there, and I said give them what they're looking for. And he said, I don't know what they're looking for. Well, they're looking for something, and we're just as presenters part of something much bigger, a sacred pilgrimage, we'll call it. People have insatiable reading appetites. According to Richard Sarr's bibliography list that he published, there are over 6,000 books, articles, reviews, and maybe upwards of 7,000 publications if you count some of the multimedia publications as well as war games. There, according to Jason Martz, who oversees all of our web and our social media, he gave me these figures a couple of days ago. There are over 2 million hits just on the park web page in 2016, and over 800,000 park blog views. And I'm not in the business here of putting down other parks. And I thought about putting up statistics for other battlefields like Antietam or Manassas or Appomattox or Fredericksburg. And trust me, in most cases, the numbers are much, much lower. Okay, and so clearly there's something that draws people to Gettysburg here disproportionately. There's a historic monument collection of over 1,300 monuments, markers, and tablets. Along with Vicksburg and Chickamauga, Gettysburg offers the greatest collection of outdoor stone and metal art in the Western Hemisphere. That's quite impressive, isn't it? And some of the most renowned artists in the last 2 centuries have sculpted on the battlefield. So an incredible collection that's a testimony to the significance of the place. What draws people to Gettysburg? Well, one, it's a great victory on northern soil. I remember when I worked in the late 1980s as a park ranger at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. Bob Crick Sr. was the chief historian there. You know, his son, Bobby Crick, is at Richmond Battlefield now, and some of you know him. But Bob Crick Sr., you know, a fine man and an excellent historian. It used to bother him that he had this wonderful park that he was chief historian of Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania and Chancellorsville and Wilderness and Brandy Station and Guinea Station. It should be the premier Civil War conglomerate in his mind. And it bothered him. I could tell it bothered him that Gettysburg still had a disproportionate amount more of attention than did Fredericksburg. And that bothers rangers in some of the other parks. So what is it? It seems like no matter what you do in these other Civil War parks, they somehow don't quite live up to the drawing power of Gettysburg. Another answer of that it's a great victory on northern soil. A second answer would be that Gettysburg's within a closer radius to the national media market than other Civil War battlefields. It's closer to New York City. And you think about it, it's the one great northern victory north of the Mason-Dixon line. If you were a northern veteran and you belonged to the VFW or the American Shriners of your time, known as the GAR, and you had your monthly meetings and you paid your dues and you pledged allegiance to the flag and helped with Civil War battlefield preservation, and you had monies for only 1 or 2 monuments, where would you put that monument? You'd put it in the place that you could visit more regularly, and one that was a great northern victory on northern soil, not one that might be in some faraway place in a remote part of the lower South. But I'm going to explore a third reason, one that I haven't seen explored yet, but one I've been working on in my head for a while, of having done this for 33 calendar years now. I have a valid opinion on this. I've watched it, I've studied it myself, that Gettysburg is our great national epic. And that I've been flirting with that idea all from the beginning up to this point. And so now let's go ahead and say it. Gettysburg is a timeless story. It has all the keys to a timeless classic like the American Iliad. Whereas Eishelman and Newman argued the entire war is the American Iliad in the book that you see to the left, I'm proposing today to you that Gettysburg has evolved into the quintessential essence of that classic timeless epic. That there's a book out there that calls the whole war the American Iliad is valid, but I'm suggesting to you today that the very essence of the epic story is Gettysburg. And if there is one more precise comparison between the Iliad and what it was in Western history, particularly ancient Western history, and the American Civil War, it would be the Battle of Gettysburg. It's our American Iliad. Now, so it's a timeless story. What are the keys to a timeless story? If you're writing a plot for a movie or you're writing a book, if you're an author and you want to reach a larger audience, you have to know this. These are the basics. If Shakespeare understood these, so did Euripides, so did Sophocles, and some of the ancient writers. Every great timeless story has a Christ-like figure versus a satanic figure. There's a hero with a tragic flaw seeking redemption. In the story, the bottom drops out, and there's sudden chaos for the hero. There's a sudden fall. Every great story has these elements. If there's a story, a movie that you watch over and over, go back and reanalyze it with these ideas, because you'll find that they're all there. The hero loses something and strives to retrieve it. Hero's desires are expressed all throughout the book, if it happens to be a story or an epic poem. And the reader knows what the hero wants. It's stated clearly in the movie that this hero wants to achieve such and such. The struggle for redemption must be as hard as possible. You ever watch an exciting film and there's one catastrophe after another, after another, after another to the hero, to the main character in the plot. And it almost it seems like the obstacles can't be overcome, and you wonder if it's becoming an unrealistic story, but they somehow survive. So there are enormous obstacles are faced in trying to retrieve that which is lost. I'll throw in something here. How many of you have heard of Alfred Hitchcock? He did all of these things, but what he did that was a little different was he would show you the chaos that was about to unleash before the main character saw it. So you knew it was coming, and it added tension to the viewer. All right, so continuing with the key elements to a timeless story, the hero matures to the moment where he or she accepts the challenge, a moment of realization where the hero has risen to whatever the challenge is. The hero changes, evolves, there's self-discovery, they're transformed by their circumstances, there's a crisis, there's a calling. So we watch the character develop in these great timeless stories, and they're transformed on the inside. They either emerge victorious or they die in the process. It's an all or nothing proposition, and the conclusions are often inevitable. And sometimes the reader is given hints to where the story is leading before they actually get there. All right, fall and redemption, the idea of a timeless story goes all the way back to the notions of, again, a fall and a redemption. That's the very essence of these great stories. So there's light and dark, there's good and evil, there's a Christ-like figure, there's a satanic figure, there's a hero that falls and is in chaos and then is looking for redemption the rest of the story. And your classic example of that would be the story that is central to all three major religions. I taught for 15 years at Harrisburg Area Community College, credit courses in the evening, ancient history courses. And so this was something when we talked about Islam or Christianity or Judaism, we pointed out the book of Genesis is common to all three of those major religions. And so this story goes to the heart of what millions of people believe. But the story is the fall. The first Adam was cursed and banished from paradise when he ate fruit from a forbidden tree. Humanity then was thrown into chaos. You can see that in the artist's depiction here. We're coming to another one. There's a sneak preview. There you go. That'll keep you hanging on your seat. But the angel escorts them out of paradise. And there's a plan of redemption that was implemented 4,000 years later when a second Adam was cursed on a tree. The Bible only speaks of two human beings that were born without earthly fathers, and that was Adam and then Jesus. And so there's this second Adam that takes the curse on the tree, and then with resurrection comes new life. And so there's a redemption. And the Old Testament is all about predicting that there'll be this Redeemer that will come along and buy back humanity and take the curse upon themselves. But there's fall and redemption. And then you have the light and dark of Star Wars. The battles contrast forces of light and darkness, and then you have nuances within that. My son was explaining it to me in depth last night. I was trying to comprehend all of it, but you all know that story is a timeless story, and it's because it has the key elements of a timeless story. There are four epics that I want to cross-compare, and then four themes I want to look at from this point forward to try to persuade you that Gettysburg is America's Iliad, that it's its epic story. And these four epics that are crucial to the identity of the ethnic groups that hold to them are the Iliad, the Aeneid, Beowulf, and Gettysburg. The Iliad is the story of ancient Greece, the Aeneid, ancient Rome, Beowulf. It's the story that's the oldest and the longest poem in Anglo-Saxon history. And then Gettysburg, we're arguing today, is our epic story. The four themes that will matrix with it would be that it's a timeless story. I'm going to continue to delve into that. Secondly, each one of these stories are not only timeless stories, but each one of them are turning points. And that makes them epic stories. They're turning points in those countries' histories. They all have virtues that those city-states, if you will, those countries, those nations adhere to and build their culture around. And then there's a destiny or preordination to each one of these stories. And I tell my students, I teach at Penn State. I've been teaching their credit courses for 3 years. And I tell my students, we're doing history at a higher level when we compare and contrast. When we compare and contrast, we draw distinctions. We learn similarities, patterns across time and space. We learn deeper truths about ourselves. So we're going to compare and contrast. Okay, the Iliad is a story of redemption, both on a personal level and also on a city-state level. The Iliad is a story of light versus dark on both the personal and city-state levels. Greek is light and Troy is dark. That is from a Greek perspective. The story of redemption on a city-state level is that Agamemnon set sail with an army of Greeks to retrieve Helen, the wife of Spartan Menelaus, who was essentially abducted by Paris, and Paris took her back to Troy, and so the war was waged to retrieve Helen. At least that's how the Iliad cast the story. And this resulted in a 10-year war between Mycenae, Greece, and Troy. Redemption, continuing with redemption, a major theme for timeless stories. Agamemnon, and this is Agamemnon here on your left. This is a cover mask that was found by Schliemann in the late 1800s at the site of Troy. And Schliemann's gold is, a part of it's now in Russia, it's in Moscow, right? But it was taken during World War II as Berlin was falling and Hitler's government was falling apart. The Russian troops took Schliemann's gold with them to Moscow. Agamemnon and Achilles remained at odds in the Trojan War. Not unlike Lee and Longstreet at Gettysburg, the two Greek leaders fought their own internal battles of light and dark. One of the reasons they didn't like each other was Agamemnon and Achilles both won women in a battle. Agamemnon had to give up his wife. The father pled for her to be returned from captivity, and he complied. So then he took Achilles', her name was Briseis, took Achilles' gal, and that put enmity between Achilles and Agamemnon. So they were angry over that more than anything else. Achilles stayed on his ship and withheld his warriors because Agamemnon had taken his wife. Achilles asked the gods for redemption. Achilles consulted the gods, prayed to the gods that they would interfere with Agamemnon's siege of Troy, cause them to fail, so that Agamemnon would have to come crawling on his knees and apologize to Achilles, and Achilles would come and save the day. So there's your internal strife, your light and dark going on within the camp. By the way, that's a major theme throughout history, is people at each other's throats and envy and strife and internal disputes. Okay, and then Achilles is our hero. Every great story has light and dark, a hero that's fallen from grace trying to gain redemption. Well, Achilles wanted redemption not only from Agamemnon for taking his gal, but he wanted redemption for his friend Patroclus, who was killed at the hands of Hector. Patroclus took Aeneas' armor. Aeneas said, I'm not going to fight, but you can go out and fight. Here's my armor. You're my best friend. And Patroclus was killed by Hector, who was the prince in Troy. And that caused Achilles to disembark on the shore, and he went in and killed half of the Trojans. You see, he was half angelic, and so half, if you will, of the gods. He was almost immortal, and he was able to kill a lot of mortals. But Achilles then met Hector face to face, and to get revenge for killing his friend, they went in a duel. He stabbed him in the throat, and as Hector was dying in this classic light versus dark hero gaining redemption story, Hector was able to mouth the words that you'll die too. Don't forget, it's in the cards for you to die as well. Achilles had a tragic flaw, and that tragic flaw was in his heel. You know, you have Achilles' heel problem. All right, this is the heroes have tragic flaws. Just keep that in mind. All great heroes have tragic flaws. You think of your sports heroes that you love the most. They have, we won't be specific and mention names, but they've all had some break with immortality. Something happened, a fall, and then they spent the rest of their career trying to recover from that. And that draws in an audience because it's part of the timeless story. The original story was that his mother, who was divine, dipped him as a baby into the water, Achilles into the water, and she held him by his foot, and everything immersed in the water except for his foot. The water made him immortal, every part except his heel, which never immersed into the water. And so the arrow was directed at his Achilles, at his mortality. And so after Achilles died, then there was a plot to remove the ships, the Greek ships, the Mycenaean Greek ships, out of view from Troy, to give the appearance that the Greeks had left. And then a horse was left behind. If this story occurred in any close way to the way it was described in the Iliad, the horse was probably a siege machine. Siege machines were used to roll up the city walls so that you could get in close without being killed by an arrow. They tended to block incoming projectiles, and siege machines allowed you to move in close enough to where you could dig under a wall, set fires that would rob the moisture of the stone so that it would become brittle, and then you could hit it with battering rams and break in the walls and then go in that way. And maybe it was a siege machine on wheels that was dressed up like a horse. There were some Trojans that did not see it as a prize, that did not want it to come into their city, but they allowed it to come into the city at the protest of some. And then at night, the horse was opened up, and in the cover of darkness, there might have just been a few men, but they opened all the Trojan city walls so that at morning, at daylight, the Mycenaean Greek ships returning could have an amphibious landing and run into the open gates and then just destroy Troy, and that's what happened. And so this is a story. You know how in our time, for most of us, we've heard about World War II our whole life, and that's been a dominating story about our entire life. Well, in ancient times, the story was the Trojan War and the Iliad and the fall of Troy. Every ancient person knew about this great battle. It was the story. Okay, notice there's a fall, but Virgil comes along hundreds of years later and tells the story of Rome, but through the redemption. Remember, fall and redemption are keys to a timeless story. Through the redemption of Troy. So it's a story of redemption of Troy. Rome's reputation was built through genealogical connections to Troy. Reputations in general were built through who your ancestors were and through heroic deeds. The Aeneid offered some of both. Now, as a point I'll make here, should I forget to later on, is a very important point to make before we move on, is that reputations are built through oral tradition. So oral histories were very important in ancient times. Here at Gettysburg, there are a lot of old guide stories that we've dismissed because there's no written paper trail for them. But they were told early on by some of the first guides that were part of burial committees, and then they were passed on orally. And the importance of them was that they built reputations. We do that, don't we? We tell stories about what we did in high school, or that pass we caught that time, and then the story grows over time. And that's the Aeneid. Virgil set out in writing the official history of Rome through the Aeneid to try to give legitimacy to Rome as an empire by making genealogical connections with Troy. Troy had been the greatest civilization in antiquity, at least for a while, before Greece defeated them. Virgil wrote this. I'll come back to it a little bit later, but Virgil wrote this around 30 BC. Okay, and so he was writing this just as the Caesars were starting to gain traction, Julius Caesar and then Augustus Caesar. I'll return to that idea later in the program. So the story picks up with where the Iliad left off. Troy is burning. Now the Iliad, I should say this about the Iliad. The siege of Troy probably occurred in some form around the 12th century BC, but it was not put in writing to the 700s BC by Homer. Virgil was writing 650 years later a sequel. Now, the Iliad had its own sequel. Homer wrote the Odyssey, and I've left that out and didn't talk about it. But the Aeneid picks up with the fall of Troy, so it's an attempt to tie Rome to the fall of Troy. So Aeneas is mentioned in the Iliad, penned almost 700 years earlier. But he's a subplot character. In the Aeneid, Virgil takes Aeneas and has him flee burning Troy. So the city's on fire. The Trojan horse has already done its damage. The city gates have been opened. King Priam has been murdered, and a number of key people have been killed, and the city's falling. Aeneas wants to fight, but he realizes everyone's dead. So he runs to his home within the city walls, and he goes in and finds his wife's been murdered, so she's dead as well. But then, according to Virgil, her spirit appears to him and says, "You must leave. Don't fight. Don't resist. You must leave and settle a great city to the west." This is the inevitability of a timeless story. So he takes anyone that will come with him and he flees. And he goes off on a journey. He makes his way to Pergamum, to Crete, to North Africa, to a place called Carthage. And then eventually he comes into Latium. And Latium is the oldest word for the city of Rome. And there he finds a lady who loves, her name is Lavina, and he's to be betrothed to marry her, but Juno interferes and has her marry, sort of against her will, Turnus, who is in charge of the local resistance force in Latium or Rome. That sets up a duel, a fight between Aeneas and Turnus. Turnus is taking his gal, and they have a head-to-head meeting in the war, in the siege of Rome, and he kills him. It's really kind of a sad scene. These stories are really tug at the heartstrings. Turnus throws a stone at Aeneas, and then the life goes out of him. He realizes that he doesn't have the will to fight. The city's already falling, and it's now just a one-on-one fight. And Aeneas shows him no mercy and kills him. And so that leads to Rome being established. Its first king, if you will, being Aeneas. Now, there's a counter story to that of Romulus and Remus settling Rome. But Aeneas is more interested in the story of, Virgil is more interested in talking about Aeneas from Troy establishing Rome. Now, before I move on any further, this is a critical point I want you to see. This was important all throughout antiquity. When Rome fell, Latium or Rome fell to Aeneas. Aeneas and his companions who pulled that whole thing off were Trojans. So, to those that have ears to hear and eyes to see and are able to discern, what Virgil is telling his readers is that Rome is now more legitimate than Greece because they find their roots in Troy. Rome is Troy reborn. Do you see that? Okay. Now, Beowulf is the great story in England. And we're going to tie this into Gettysburg in a wonderful way here, but I'm setting it up. Okay. Beowulf is a story also of light and dark, and it is the oldest poem that we would consider an epic poem related to the origins of the Anglo-Saxons. Light and dark is represented when Beowulf fought Grendel. There's also a major theme in Beowulf of a sacrificial death on behalf of securing the kingdom. And so in this story, light and dark, then, good and evil, which are essential to timeless stories, are played out. Now, we're looking at an artist's depiction of Harriet Mead Hall from Beowulf. This is an artist's conception of Mead Hall where the Danish king Hrothgar showed hospitality to Beowulf and his companions. When Beowulf arrived with his companions in Ligier, Denmark, that's believed to be the site today. There's archaeology being done there to where the story originates. Hrothgar invited Beowulf and his companions, his warrior companions, in, and they had a feast. And anytime you have a hall like this with light and so forth, it represents light, warmth, and hospitality. Anytime you read an epic story where there are people gathered in a tavern and there's warmth and there's light and there's laughter and their presents being given, the symbolism there is hospitality. Hospitality is a virtue to ancient people. Remember that. It's going to show up in all the stories that you read. But after the feast is over, Hrothgar turns his attention to Beowulf as to why he's really there, and it's to kill Grendel, who's this monstrous beast that's been devouring people in that kingdom. And he likes to come apparently into the feast hall after everyone goes to sleep and have his fill, So Beowulf is taken on the challenge, and after everyone leaves and the feasting is over, he waits in the dark for Grendel to show. And Grendel shows, and he's been depicted. The story was oral history in the 600s A.D., and then it was penned in the 8th century A.D. So the story's been told for hundreds of years, and there was even a recent movie on it that came out maybe, about 10 years ago or so. But Beowulf and Grendel go at it. He kills this devouring monster, Grendel, along with his mother, to free the Danes, and returns to a hero's welcome back to his own kingdom, which is also in Denmark. Now, the monster that's described in Beowulf can mean a person with a deformity, or more likely an alien presence that must be removed to restore safety. So the monster doesn't necessarily have to be incredibly abnormal. The monster can be a person with a deformity. But in any case, his deformity is that he was murdering people, and Beowulf killed him. Well, heroes, engage in these great battles of light and dark. And then, after reigning for 50 years as a Danish king, he fought a dragon to the death. This is talked about in Beowulf, to secure his people. This dragon had intimidated people, had stolen treasures, and so he killed the dragon. Beowulf set an example for his warriors by standing in the face of fire when everyone else fled. And so anytime you have a great epic story, a timeless story, the hero stands up when everyone else runs. When the dragon started to breathe fire, All of the warriors fled except for him, and he stood and he fought to the death. There was one young warrior that returned, and in his dying breaths, Beowulf, with the dragon also dying, Beowulf said to the young man that you can take over the kingdom. Again, that was this selfless final act of Beowulf on behalf of his people. But when he was then cremated, Beowulf is cremated at the end of this epic story by his warriors. He's buried in a mound with the treasures that are found with the dragon, overlooking the ocean. As in the mound, if you look at Viking burial mounds, they're all over the place, but the burial mounds with the treasures and with Beowulf's ashes could be seen far offshore to further warn ships not to come ashore and to wreck there. The warriors, there were 12 warriors, and they rode around the mound because he had given them a final act of courage. All heroes show bravery and courage. He died for his people. When they all fled, he faced the fire of the dragon. Hancock rode with cannons ablaze here at Gettysburg. He rode the battle line during the greatest artillery duel in the history of the Western Hemisphere. He constantly put himself in harm's way on behalf of his men. You all know that, don't you? Okay, and if you number crunch, there were 4 to 6 artillery shells hitting something or exploding every second for 2 hours during the cannonade. It was heard in Baltimore, Maryland. It was incredible. It's amazing that he was able to ride the line back and forth with artillery ablaze for 2 hours and essentially go unharmed. Why? So his men, who were lying on the reverse slope of Cemetery Ridge behind stone walls and so forth, could look up and see his image silhouetted against the sky as he rode along Cemetery Ridge. He couldn't fire a shot, but he could be an example to them as they were enduring all kinds of phobic-like conditions, having to endure that cannonade. That's what heroes do, whether you're talking about Beowulf or the Aeneid or the Iliad. In Gettysburg, as we cross-compare Gettysburg with Beowulf, the great English epic, and cross-reference it with Aeneid or the Iliad, light and dark is a theme that we see in Gettysburg as well. Right? And from a Union perspective, the Union Army of Potomac stood for freedom and light as expressed in the Gettysburg Address, whereas the Confederacy represented degrees of unfreedom that accompanied the institution of slavery. Right? There, you've got light and dark in a classic epic story. We've really been making that point all along. Hopefully you've got that part. Every timeless story has good and evil, light and dark, whether it's in the Iliad, whether it's Achilles and Hector, or whether it's in the Aeneid with Turnus and Aeneas, or in Beowulf, where there's Beowulf and Grendel, there's light and dark, and the hero has to rise to the challenge, right? Or whether it's Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker, there's this, right? Okay, and so that's what we have going on. I would suggest to you here at Gettysburg is we have a picture of light and dark. Now, redemption in this story that makes Gettysburg a timeless epic came through the reversal of 2 years of military setbacks. The Union Army had come close to winning, probably should have won several battles, showed that their warriors were every bit that of the Confederates in the first 2 years of the war. But if you were keeping score and you count Antietam as a tie, General Lee was 12-1-0. He had yet to lose a battle, right? And some would say 13-0. But in any case, this was frustrating to soldiers time and time again on the Union side that saw victory snatched from them at the last minute by someone's timidity in McClellan's staff or elsewhere. So redemption also specifically came to George Willard's brigade, who had been captured at Harper's Ferry and re-enlisted. You all know that story. And they yelled, "Harper's Ferry, Harper's Ferry, Harper's Ferry," as Pickett's troops were being repulsed on the third day of the battle. Redemption came to those who had endured Fredericksburg. In many ways, Pickett's charge seemed a reversal of the attack on Marye's Heights. And a lot of Union soldiers yelled, "Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg." That's redemption. Remember that when you hear these stories being told on the battlefield. Epic tales tie in to redemption, to heroes. Now, defeating the monster is more than just Beowulf fighting Grendel. Defeating the monster, as we cross-reference with the Civil War, from a Union perspective, is defeating the Confederacy. Defeating the Confederacy was like slaying a dragon. Pickett's charges become the event and moment when the Confederacy started to decline. Most people would agree with that. And so we see a beast that seems part dragon. The idea is that the Confederacy was a monstrous presence, an alien force that threatened the Union. Do you see the parallels? I'm really had to think through that, okay? Now, you have to understand, light and dark did not take the same form from a Confederate perspective in this epic story. The Confederates were, let's just go ahead and read this and then I'll comment. From a Southern perspective, the contrast between light and dark is not defined between North and South, but rather drawn between Lee and Longstreet, between Lee and those who are perceived to have let him down. The lost cause narrative redeemed Lee and vilified Longstreet. If you listen to enough Southerners that are interested in the battle, that visit here, rarely, if ever, will they criticize Hancock or Meade. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find a Southerner that visits here that's preoccupied with making negative remarks about the Union Army. Southerners are more interested in the conflict between Lee and Longstreet, or Lee and Stuart, and what the Southerners did wrong. Remember, General Pickett said when he heard Southerners pointing the fingers at each other after the war as to who lost and why, and he said, always thought the Union Army had something to do with it. Southerners, light and dark is defined not between gray and blue, but more or less Lee and those that didn't support him here. And if you look at the lost causes, major tenets as to why the South fought, what they were fighting for, and why they lost, one of those 6 tenets is Longstreet essentially lost the Civil War at Gettysburg. So he was demonized. He was made the satanic figure. He was made the dark force. He became the Darth Vader. He did all of those things. He became a Roman Catholic when the South was Protestant. He became a Republican when the South was Democrat. He was a Georgian in a Virginia army. He was all of those things that caused him to oppose Lee. And he drug his feet on the second day of the battle. He was supposed to have a sunrise attack on the third day. That's what Southerners are in. That's where the light and dark is found for them. Now, we move from timeless stories to turning points. Every epic story has not only timeless features, light and dark, fall and redemption, a hero with a tragic flaw. We've made those points. But now let's move on to another major theme. All of these epic tales have a turning point. Now let's move away from the Iliad as an epic story for a minute, and let's look at why the fight between Mycenae, Greece, and the Trojans was a turning point in Western history. In the Iliad, what's really at stake here is not a fight over recovering Helen. That makes it an epic story. But the nuts and bolts of it is that it was a fight over the Dardanelles and over middle ground. The defeat of Troy gave Mycenae, Greece, control over the middle ground between their empire and the Hittite Empire. This is the middle ground that defined East and West during antiquity. I'll show you a map here of this area in just a second. But there are terrorist activities that are going on now in Istanbul or former Constantinople. You've seen that on the news. That's Turkey, or in antiquity it was called Anatolia. And that would be the connecting point between the Near East and the West. That's where East meets West, between Turkey and Greece. Okay, and that's that's why it's in the news now. It's why it's critical in terrorism, because it's seen as the connecting point between East and West. That's why Constantine built his new city of Rome and moved it there initially before Islam conquered it and turned it to Istanbul, was because Constantinople was centrally located between East and West. And so long before that, in the 12th century BC, the Mycenaean Greeks took that middle ground. The defeat of Troy gave Mycenaean Greece control over the Dardanelles, connecting the Aegean Sea with the Sea of Marmara and the Black Sea. As you see Greece, and you see Sparta, where Helen was taken from, and you see Troy. Troy is strategically located on the Dardanelles Straits. There was a great battle there in World War I involving Winston Churchill. And there was, why? Because this is an important, the Russians have always been interested in the Dardanelles because the Aegean Sea, which is connected to the Mediterranean, via the Dardanelles, it's almost like a natural canal, connects with the Marmara, and above that, the Black Sea, which is adjacent to the Ukraine and to Russia, and then beyond that, the Bay of Finland and the Baltic, and access to Scandinavia. So you've got this connection between the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, North Sea, and the Mediterranean via the Dardanelles. And Troy was strategically significant because it's set on that. Helen dominates the Iliad as a cause for redemption for the war. But the real reason they were fighting and why the Trojan War was a turning point was because the Dardanelles was taken and middle ground between East and West was taken. It's very important. The Aeneid is also a turning point, a watershed, and that makes it an epic tale. Aeneid, Virgil was writing to his Roman audience 100 years after the Punic Wars. The 3 Punic Wars transformed Rome from an early republic to empire. Rome emerged from the war to overthrow the Greek Empire within a few years. So a watershed period in Roman history was the Punic Wars. There were 3 wars. You know about the second one probably more than all the others. That featured Hannibal and his elephants crossing the Pyrenees, from Spain into Italy, and then great battles that would lead to the destruction of Scipio Africanus's army, and then being able to waste the land. Hannibal roamed all across Italy. But there were 3 Punic Wars. In the final Punic War, the Romans invaded Carthage, it's modern-day Tunisia, and that's in North Africa, and overthrew Carthage and salted the ground so that nothing could be grown there again. Literally rubbing salt in the wound. And but what Virgil's trying to say in the Aeneid, it's very important the time when he was writing. That's true of every book. When you do a book review, look at when it was written. It was probably influenced by what was going on politically at the time. Something politically inspired the writing of the book at that time. Probably had an influence on the author's perspective. But Virgil wanted to justify the 3 wars with Carthage, the Punic Wars, between 264 BC and 146 BC. He wanted to justify them. Why? Because those wars pivoted. They were turning point, watershed wars, changing, altering, transforming Rome from a local regional power to an empire. And there were people like Cato and Cicero and others that mourned, that were very sad that Rome lost its the innocence that it had as an empire, as a republic before it became an empire. But the Aeneid is trying to say the opposite, is trying to say, no, these wars were justified, and the greatness of Rome and its superior culture needs to be taken to the rest of the world. That's what Virgil is saying in his book. So one of the central points to the story is that Aeneas, after leaving Troy to redeem Troy by settling Rome, which is a new Troy, he stops in Carthage, falls in love with Dido, Queen Dido, and Virgil made it clear, Rome was justified warring with Carthage due to enmity between Aeneas and Queen Dido. They fell in love. They had a relationship. He left, because some of his advisors said, look, your mission is inevitable. You must settle this great city in the west that they would call Latium or Rome. And you can't stay here. I don't care how much you love her. You have to leave. And so when he left, she pled and pled and pled that he not leave, and then she committed suicide with his sword. And as she was dying, she threw herself onto a funeral pyre so that he could see the flames lit, Aeneas could see the flames lit as his ships were disembarking and heading from North Africa to the tip of the boot in Italy. As he was leaving, he could see the flames and he knew what it was. But she declared, and Virgil makes it clear to you, that she declared permanent enmity from this scorned love. And so Virgil tells you it's okay that Rome fights with Carthage because of this fallen relationship. It was in the cards. It was declared. Okay, and Beowulf is a turning point more from a literary standpoint. It's a watershed book in that in the 8th century AD represents a period when Anglo-Saxon nobility sought to strengthen their relational ties with Danish kings to legitimize claims to power. So when I used to teach an ancient history course at Hack, one of the points we made when we talked about the 700s AD is that the French, they were called the Merovingians, they came up with a story to try to make their ties to Christ through a child, and you've heard that story and all, and eventually the Carolingians under Charles the Great overthrew them around 800 AD. But the idea was they were really reaching, weren't they, to try to connect themselves with Jesus Christ, and sort of a far-fetched story so they could legitimize themselves and the people wouldn't turn on them. It's amazing, what you do to hang on to power. The 8th century also marks a period when courtly writers fused Christian values with older Germanic traditions to conform with a Roman Catholic worldview. In oral tradition, Beowulf was less Christian. But by the time it was penned in the 8th century, the writer, who's anonymous, put all kinds of Christian values and virtues. And so he behaved in a noble way, did Beowulf. It was more far-reaching and more noble and more honorable and more valorous than had it just been presented the way the Germans would have told it by word of mouth. Gettysburg is also, like these other epic stories, a turning point, and that's why this epic tale is so appealing. First off, it's the high watermark of the rebellion. I had to write an article a few years ago for North and South magazine. If you all remember that magazine, I might still be publishing. Before the internet really gained traction, there were some Civil War magazines, and the Rangers contributed to them. And so I got an opportunity. Someone asked me to write 1,000 words to argue in a special Civil War edition, 1863 edition. See, I think it was for the 140th anniversary, something like that. But I was to argue that Gettysburg was the high watermark. And the editor picked out someone from Vicksburg to argue that Vicksburg was the high watermark, And so I had 1,000 words, and I wrote a couple thousand, and I had to keep cutting and pasting and trimming it down. And then they trimmed it down even further by the time it hit print. But I thought, well, how can I get to the essence of arguing that Gettysburg is the turning point of the war, that it's the real high tide of the Confederacy, the high watermark? And this was my answer, that in the Civil War, two armies, this is true of Napoleonic War, tended to fight not to annihilation, but rarely ever in human history has there been one great battle that destroyed another army and the flower of its culture in one day. There's been a handful of those battles, and that's why we know them by name. But that rarely ever happened. Typically, battles would be of attrition to one side would be worn down to the point where they could no longer take the offensive. And when that time came, politicians would intervene and they would negotiate a deal while there was still some leverage to be had and you could leave with saving face and some dignity. And what I argued in the article that Gettysburg was the turning point of the Civil War. rather than Vicksburg or some other place, was that it was the moment in the war where Robert E. Lee lost the ability to take the offense. When you lose the ability to take the offense, you must come to the bargaining table soon. Why? Because the element of surprise is gone. When your opponent, it's like a football team in the fourth quarter when they're down by 30 points and they're not going to run the ball. If you're rushing, you no longer hold up. You just blindly roll or kick or swim to get to the quarterback because you don't have to worry about a run. You become predictable when half of your options are gone. And so Lee lost the ability to take the offense. Yes, there were some offensive thrusts in Virginia the last 2 years of the war, but there was never an attempt. Yes, there was the crossing of the Monocacy, which my colleague Dan Vermillion can tell you a lot about. He works there as well as here as Gettysburg. But so there was some offensive thrust by Robert E. Lee into the North or towards the North. There was never a full blown invasion with all the complexity that you see at Antietam or Gettysburg after Gettysburg. And then the Northern people's resolve was strengthened by the win at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, which helped further the cause, and there would have to be some more cogs in that wheel, further the cause of Lincoln's reelection. It meant the draft could take full effect, which meant the Union Army would continue to grow while the Southern Army diminished. And that moment is Pickett's charge. Okay, and so that's why Gettysburg is the turning point of the war. It's the moment where Robert E. Lee lost the ability to take the offensive at the operational level. Gettysburg is also the turning point, watershed moment of the Civil War, and that's why it's America's Iliad or Aeneid or Beowulf, in that it introduces a new birth of freedom. You all know I do an hour and a half presentation on the Gettysburg Address line by line. The first birth in the Gettysburg Address is that our fathers brought forth and they conceive in liberty, and she bears a son. Liberty bears a son. All men are created equal. The first birth is liberty, and its articulation is all men are created equal. That dies at Gettysburg, dies in the Civil War. Lincoln calls for a new birth out of the ashes, a redemption. And the new birth is not liberty, but the new birth is a new birth of freedom. And the difference between liberty and freedom is freedom, you have all of your same liberties. It's just that you police yourself so that your liberties don't infringe on someone else. You have a right to bear arms, but just like you did in the first birth. Under freedom, you have a right to bear arms, but you don't have a right to go into community college and shoot at people. You have a right to freedom of speech, but like you did in the first birth. But in the new birth of freedom, you don't have a right to infringe on other people's freedom by going into a crowded theater and yelling fire. You have a right to property in the second birth, in the new birth of freedom that Lincoln espouses. You have a right to that. But to property. But you don't have a right in the new birth to human property. You see, life, liberty, and property is your right, your liberty. But freedom says you don't take it so far as to own another human being. So the new birth of freedom was articulated here at Gettysburg. That makes Gettysburg a turning point. Another reason why it's our epic tale, Gettysburg is because it's the beginnings of a national government over a federal one. A national government, you hear about all kinds of national this and national that, you fill in the blanks. But the idea of national government versus federal government is different. Federal government calls for a compact of states where the states and local governments maintain their autonomy and sovereignty and their leverage against the federal government. A national government is that the local governments and the state governments are consolidated and the lines are blurred so that the national government is supreme. Okay, and so a national government, and I know we're still struggling with that one, and there'll always be a struggle there, as there should be. Where's the balance between a national and federal government? But the beginnings of a national government, the first time nation was ever mentioned in a speech by a president in the way that we interpret nation today, was Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address. He said that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. Nation. And then it's the tipping point of a modern war was Gettysburg. That's why it's a turning point. It's the Battle of Gettysburg is arguably the last war of gentlemen, where they fought in open fields, where there are partial fortifications and field fortifications. But by the time you get to Spotsylvania in May of 1864, you look at the salient there, and the earthworks were becoming increasingly larger and larger. To by the end of the Civil War, you have trench warfare, which would carry over into World War I. And so Gettysburg is one of those last great romantic battles, if we can call it that. So like the Aeneid and like Beowulf and like the Iliad, it's a turning point. And then our last stretch here is we'll talk about, I told everyone I would be done by a quarter after, so we have 13 minutes here. And then Facebook goes quiet at that point. But the last part, the theme that we want to look at, actually it's the next to the last, but the next to the last ends in a matter of 2 or 3 minutes. Maybe the last substantive theme that we want to look at as we compare these epic stories is that an epic must teach virtues. A great story must teach virtues. Okay, virtues are interwoven into the fabric of each great epic for the purpose of teaching future generations what it means to be a great citizen of Greece, Rome, England, or the United States. You may not realize it, but when you come here to Gettysburg, there are messages all around you about what you should aspire to be a better citizen. And that's what epic stories do. They talk about these virtues that we must all work on. Now, Beowulf had his virtues. He adhered to the warrior code of courage, strength, restraint, loyalty, hospitality, and benevolence. He weighed retaliation with doing what was right because of consequences in the afterlife. Beowulf's perspective gradually transformed from a youth pursuing personal glory to a wise king seeking protection of his people. Beowulf persuades that wisdom is a virtue that comes with age and experience. So you have these virtues all throughout Beowulf. Why? Because you want to teach the future generations this is what it means to be English. Or in our case, the virtues that are extolled here at Gettysburg teach us what it means to be an American. All right, and so what are these virtues? Justice, truth, impartiality, fairness, prudence, frugality, strength, and purity. These are things that we should aspire to be noble. Right? That's what the veterans want you to see. Okay, and that's why this is an epic story. Notice as we look at the Seal of New York, we have excellence, embedded into the story, into the seal. We have the scales of justice. We have the sword of truth. We have strength in the eagle. We have the liberty pole and liberty cap. So we're looking at freedom here and liberty. The blindfold represents impartiality, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, that you will be fair to someone. These are things that we strive to be, right? To be higher beings, to strive for. We're not going to reach immortality on this earth, but these are the virtues that are the path to immortality, that all the great epic tales passed along. Heroic virtues are also wrapped up in other monuments, like the Alabama Memorial. I know Barb put together an excellent program for children, and I was inspired by the program you developed on this particular slide. But if you were to look at the Alabama Monument and study that monument here on this battlefield, the lady that we see depicted here, her name is Determination. Well, that's a virtue. So when you see her, you shouldn't just see a lady telling some soldiers from Alabama to go forward and attack Little Round Top. You should see that the soldiers from Alabama, the state of Alabama, are emphasizing a virtue that they want their children to adhere to passersby to contemplate: determination, perseverance, endurance, fortitude, and will. I heard Jimmy V say in a recording, never, ever, 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 ever give up, right? That's what we're talking about here. That's a virtue. In the monuments, we should see more than stone and metal. We should see in the Masonic Memorial graciousness and victory and defeat. A Union soldier, William Henry Harrison Bingham, kneeling down to help a Confederate, General Armistead, showing compassion and honor. These are not loose words. These are virtues that we should all aspire to. Graciousness and defeat. I was a basketball coach for my son's 6th grade basketball team, and even then we didn't feel like it, we lined up at the end and shook hands and said, "Good game, good game, good game." You know, good, even though you've done that before. And it's because you have to be gracious in defeat. And of course, the ultimate example is showing that when life and death hang in the balance. Okay, the 1st Minnesota, courage, bravery, fortitude. The idea that the Minnesotans could look out, and they were told by General Hancock to go take a flag. Well, they must have seen thousands of Floridians, Alabamians, and we have to talk to Chuck Teague on this, but some Georgians somewhere in the area, you know, and there were thousands of Confederates headed towards them, and they had to have known that they would be fortunate if half of them came back, but they still went forward. That's a virtue: courage, bravery, fortitude. Over on Culp's Hill, to Maryland's loyal sons. Notice the word loyal. Loyalty is a virtue. So is patience. The 78th and 102nd New York over on Culp's Hill has embedded in it the likeness of, the head of, and the paws of a what? A lion, which symbolizes courage. The veterans want you to see that. Courage. They're emphasizing one word. It's a virtue that you would find in Beowulf, that you would find in the Iliad or the Aeneid. Buford, duty. Right? There's not a lot of fluff and flair about him. He just did his job, right? He showed up and he did what he had to do. Duty. He did it. Duty means, and this is true of when you're an adult, there are times where you don't feel like going to work, times where you don't feel like doing this, staying up late to pay the bills, or working an extra job to pay for Christmas, or whatever it is. But it's your duty as a parent, or your duty as a citizen. You do your duty. That's a virtue. Hospitality. This is Josephine Rogers Miller, and she's standing in front of the 1st Massachusetts Infantry. They brought her, did the 1st Massachusetts Infantry, they paid for her for have a train ride to come back to Gettysburg for one of the anniversaries. To pose in front of the stove where she baked bread at the Rogers house along the Emmitsburg Road. Do you know there were the smells of fresh baked bread during Pickett's Charge? But that's hospitality. I'll give you a little quiz. What are a couple of other acts of hospitality on the battlefield? Jenny Wade baking bread for Georgia. Spangler Spring, Spangler Meadow. They took turns to fill up their canteens in the dark there. That's hospitality. Do you remember I showed you the slide for Beowulf earlier, where before Beowulf took on Grendel, they had a feast with Hrothgar and light and warmth and hospitality, where these were virtues that Beowulf, the writer of Beowulf, wanted to impart to its readers. I would suggest to you today, after we're done, go to a place like the Dobbin House, to Gary Owen, to Farnsworth House, to the Cashtown Inn, the Fairfield Inn, to any number of places, the pub, the Blue and Gray, Mama V's, Auroric's, and go in there, the Mines, and have some hospitality, some warmth and light this evening. That's a virtue. It's a virtue, hospitality. Not trying to pour it on too thick, but my colleague Barb over here has that gift, that virtue, hospitality, baking things for the staff and doing things for the staff. Hospitality is a virtue. And then Elizabeth Thorne, right, who was a caretaker of the cemetery, apparently helped with 120 burials. 40 burials she was largely responsible for. Her husband, Peter Thorne, was near Washington in the entrenchments there and not with Army of Potomac. They were caretakers for the Evergreen Cemetery. And sacrifice, She was 7 months pregnant, for gosh sakes, and her child was sickly and never made it to adulthood. Loyalty, selfless, devotion, these are all virtues that we aspire to, and our epic stories tell us to aspire to these to achieve immortality. Loyalty and fidelity. When you see Sally the dog at the 11th Pennsylvania over at Stop 3 on the auto tour, or you see the Irish wolfhound, it's a beautiful dog, and it's wonderful if you have dogs and want to relate that way, but there's a much deeper message being passed on. Dogs always symbolize loyalty. That's a virtue. You would find that in Beowulf. And the 7th Maine Infantry over on Lost Avenue, behind Dean Schultz's house, they were part of what corps? The 6th Corps. The 6th Corps marched how many miles on the second day of the battle? So anytime you see a statue to the 6th Corps, look for references, symbols to endurance. 32 miles on a single day. If you had to pick one word to describe the 6th Corps in the Gettysburg campaign, it's endurance, isn't it? That long march here. And devotion, Colonel Jeffords of the 4th Michigan in the wheat field. A few weeks before the Gettysburg campaign, he went to Washington, D.C., and there was a ceremony where an official from Michigan, in front of a crowd of people, presented Colonel Jeffords in the 4th Michigan a new flag. And Jeffords had to say in front of the crowd and to the man who presented it to him, representing the state of Michigan, that he would not lose that flag in the upcoming campaign. He could only imagine where it would be. Well, he would have an opportunity to live up to that promise on the second day at Gettysburg when de Trobriand's troops were being overrun, and when that whole section of the battlefield, Tilton and Schweitzer's troops were being overrun, and the 4th Michigan went out and stood with Georgians and South Carolinians swarming the area, and they were closing in to bayonet him and to take the flag, and he wrested the flag away from them. And so devotion to that flag. You could give a lot of examples of devotion, couldn't you? Especially with a flag. And virtues of resolve and fortitude. The 20th Maine on Little Round Top. They were told by strong Vincent, hold this ground at all hazards. You know, there's not a lot of other options with that order, is there? All right. And so for 2.5 hours, they stood in the midst of what might have been around 50,000 rounds fired there. And they didn't retreat. There were times where they might have felt the urge to leave, fight or flight, but they fought. And they had incredible resolve and fortitude. They marched 56 miles from Frederick City, Maryland to here in 3 days. That's fortitude. And then when you think of discipline, you think of the U.S. regulars, don't you? The U.S. regulars served not only here at Gettysburg, but in some cases 25, 30-year appointments. They were the ideal for soldiers all throughout the war. The regulars were the standing army during peacetime. Discipline. They showed the example of discipline. Wisdom, Pap Green, right? John White Geary, the future governor of Pennsylvania, said in his report that the defenses on Culp's Hill would have not held without Pap Green's fortifications. Pap Green designed Croton Reservoir in New York City. I talked to someone on a tour 3 years ago that works for the water systems in Manhattan, and he said there is still some infrastructure from Pap Green's construction there. Do you think he knew how to build fortifications on Culp's Hill? And wisdom, 62 years of age at a time when the average soldier was 19, 20 years of age. They called him Pap. And so we conclude with this. We'll 3 more slides here. With the theme of destiny. Actually, it's just a few more slides, but it's all a sweeping conclusion here. Destiny. All of these great epic stories have a preordination, a destiny to them, almost an inevitability to them, a certainty to them. The Iliad espoused the virtues of Greece and therefore ordained the spread of Hellenism. Alexander the Great, when he conquered the known world, you know who his teacher was as a child? Aristotle. Aristotle taught him the Iliad and taught him about Greeks' right to control Turkey and their right to dominate the known world because they had a superior civilization. Greek philosophy, Greek medicine, Greek science, Greek architecture. So there was a certain destiny that the Iliad carries out. The Israelites, I'll throw this one in, they crossed the Jordan and entered the Promised Land with Joshua at the helm and won the great Battle of Jericho. The Israelites believed the land was theirs based on an ancient covenant with Abraham. So there was a certain inevitability that they were to control, and they're still fighting for that ground now. Achilles knew he would die, yet he fought hard. He was told by Hector in his dying breaths, you're going to die too, remember this. You're not going to make it out of this tragic story alive. Aeneas was told by the spirit of his deceased wife and his mother Venus that he would settle a great city to the west. Now, obviously there's clearly some hyperbole here, but there's this notion of inevitability. America has a date with destiny, doesn't it? There's a certain inevitability in American history that's guided America. American history began with destiny, shining city on a hill. The Pilgrims declared that, and then American exceptionalism came along in the mid-19th century, the idea that the rest of the world has been this way except America. That idea still crops up in political speeches. Manifest destiny, that destiny spread west, a moral imperative to settle the West. And the idea that America had a destiny, and that meant sea to shining sea. That destiny was confirmed at Gettysburg. Destiny was confirmed on a sacrificial altar to the freedom at Gettysburg. Here's your sacrificial altar. That's what it really is. It's a sacrificial altar. And this is where America's fate with destiny was confirmed. And then the national destiny was articulated. 4 months after the battle, Lincoln proclaimed a new birth of freedom vision for the country going forward. We're still working on that now, defining what freedom is. This speech defined America's national identity of greater freedom for all. See, there's an inevitability to this. There's a mission statement. And so today, we go back looking for the essence of our national identity. To the English and to the Danes and to the Germans, they make the pilgrimage to Liège, Denmark, to the archaeological site of Beowulf, to learn its virtues. People every year pilgrimage to Troy to learn about light and dark and the whole notion of redemption. Or they pilgrimage, there's the pilgrimage of the Aeneid to Rome to see where Troy was redeemed through Aeneas taking Latium and declaring, it the great city of the West that he was foreordained to settle. And then people pilgrimage to Gettysburg. And so there's something that draws us here, and we've been talking about that for the last while. Why do we make the pilgrimage? It is in this pilgrimage to Gettysburg that we find our collective selves. We subconsciously know that Gettysburg is an essential part of who we are as Americans, and that we will not be complete until the journey is made. Ivy, this is why you come here, okay? We are also drawn to the story because it is as old as civilization itself, contrasting light with dark, and telling the story of many heroes battling with their own mortality in search of redemption. Why do we make the pilgrimage? Our convictions about what is noble, good, true, and virtuous are confirmed, too, in a myriad of ways through hundreds of stories repeated by guides and thousands of subliminal messages conveyed by monuments. In some shape or form, we all leave this place more aware of ourselves. In a sense, we leave Gettysburg redeemed. Thank you for coming out.